of design, of work. So I'm going to get into the content of the exhibition in our talk today, but I really do encourage you to see it firsthand. We have documents on display that are more than, that are 200 plus years old, telling us about the history of slavery. What do we know? How do we know what we know? And what are the questions we can ask of these documents that have been saved for so long? Now, many of the documents we're going to be looking at today, and the stories will be storytelling around, they weren't intended for this purpose. These were people who were writing things down as receipts. They were making transactions. Their transactions happened to be the buying and selling of people. And so when we're looking at some of these documents, be they inventories or census documents or bills of sale, what we need to do is read against the grain. The intention was not for us to read these documents and learn more and center the stories of enslaved, but that is what our task is right now, because, except in very rare instances, the enslaved themselves were not centered, were not given a voice, often could not read and write, and thus their day-to-day experiences, the substance and the texture of their relationships, their favorite colors, how they held their mouth when they smiled, these are all things that are lost to us. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't still have a certain amount of curiosity around their humanity, because the more that we honor the humanity of those who were enslaved, the more we reject the fundamental injustice of a system of slavery that claims that a person can be property, when we know that no human being can be valued as property, that their life has meaning because they are people as we are people. So, as I mentioned earlier, part of this program, part of this exhibition, and also what I'm here to talk with you about today, is also to honor the work that we do when we research our own family history. I just had a conversation walking up the stairs with somebody, making the point that the goal is not to say everyone should be researching their family history, that you have a responsibility to. We know, and especially for those of us who represent a Black American experience, that researching your family's history is not always a pleasant and uplifting thing. You can find information that is really painful. You can also hit a wall, hit a dead end that is frustrating because it reveals to us in all too much of a reality how much we weren't able to leave behind, how much our voices weren't cared for enough to be saved. So the point isn't to say you should be doing this research, but to honor those who have and to thank them for that work, because the way you research your ancestors, you are looking for a human being. You are honoring their humanity, and for so long, the historical record and the historical narrative haven't done that. So by looking at family genealogy researchers on the one hand, and historians looking at archival documents in the other, we can create a fuller picture. We can have all of the information, we can ask the right questions, we can dream the right dreams, and we can also be in community with one another, and that's part of this narrative as well. So, to kick us off, starting with this document, and a lot of the documents themselves are not going to be very big enough to read, so I've blown up some of the relevant text here so that we can read it. But this is a critical document from 1652, and this is a piece of legislation from the Netherlands, communicating to Peter Stuyvesant, the governor of the Netherlands, who were colonizing what was Lenape land and Rockaway land and Canarsie land and Marechkowick land, that they could start importing African slaves in order to further agriculture in New Netherlands, what will become New York City, what will become Brooklyn. So the inhabitants of New Netherlands shall be at liberty to purchase Negroes wheresoever they may think necessary, except on the coast of Guinea, and bring them into New Netherland to work on their boweries. Boweries, the Dutch word for farm. So we have quite a bit of information from just this piece of text. You can see that it's seen better days. This particular document is not in our collection. This is from the State Archives in Albany. We can see that this is the moment, right? This is the moment when the Dutch say, you know what, we're going to build an outpost here. We're going to need farms. We're going to need produce. And we want to be making a profit from that labor. And in order to make a profit, we don't want to pay workers. We want to get that profit, keep all the profit from our farms for ourselves, and thus we are going to import kidnapped African people to do that work on these farms. And I think it's critical to make the point that this is farm labor, largely in Brooklyn, because sometimes there's a misconception that slavery in the South is agricultural, is plantation, is field hands working in fields in the hot sun, toiling day over day. And in the North, that it was easier, that it was domestic. It didn't look quite the same. Now, it is true that there was agricultural slavery in the South, and there was domestic slavery in the North. There was also domestic slavery in the South. There was also agricultural slavery in the North. And specific to Brooklyn, agricultural slavery was really the name of the game. The fact that New York City becomes our nation's first capital and is now the largest city in the United States has a direct relation to the slavery that was taking place in Brooklyn. They weren't really, is this, we're all good? Yeah, almost done? Okay. Position for ready. Oh, sure. Move over this way? Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, I want to fix this too.
Position ourselves here. More. All the way off stage. There we go. We're good?
Yes.
Okay, I'll try to get closer to the mic here. There we go. So, as I was saying, it's important to make that point that as New York City is growing, as it eventually becomes our nation's first capital, the largest city in the United States, there, in large part, was not that much farming that was being done over on the island of Manhattan, right? But the people who are working there, who are building the banks, who are creating a government, who are creating a society, they needed to eat, right? They needed to thrive. And the cabbage and potatoes and carrots and livestock that were feeding that growing city were right here in Brooklyn and largely made possible through slave labor, which began here in the 1650s and continued until slavery ends in New York State in 1827. So for more than 150 years in Brooklyn, we have chattel agricultural slavery, wherein enslaved Africans were brought here to toil on those farms, to create profits for those who owned them, and also to create a resource infrastructure that made the growth of New York City possible. So in the exhibition, we talk, the language we use is slavery didn't just happen in Brooklyn, it changed Brooklyn. Okay, yes, so as I mentioned before, slavery as a practice is built on a fundamental injustice. To own a person as property is to deny the incontrovertible fact of their humanity. Despite this injustice, this fundamental injustice, slavery thrived in Brooklyn for more than a century, from the early days of European settlement in the 1600s until slavery ended in 1827 here in New York State, after a period of gradual emancipation beginning in the 1790s. To give a sense of the range of this, a staggering 40% of Brooklyn households own slaves. Now, when I say Brooklyn, Brooklyn kind of wasn't a thing yet in this time period. So Kings County was made up of several different villages that made up what will become Brooklyn, what will become our Kings County today. And in certain villages of Kings County, particularly Flatbush, which we'll be talking about a lot today, that percentage of slave-owning families got as high as 75%. So it is a large percentage, in fact, the majority of white families in Brooklyn, or at least in the area of Flatbush that will become part of today's borough of Brooklyn, slavery was more than the norm, it was the majority. So to give a sense, as I mentioned, I'm not able to see my cursor, so I'm just going to kind of gesture over here. So you can see over on my right, your left, this is the original, I mentioned that Brooklyn's made up of a few different villages. This is a map of not only those original villages, but the native land upon which they were superimposed. Because of course, for centuries before any European contact, This was not only indigenous land, but land that was stewarded by indigenous growing practices. So you might be familiar with things like Three Sisters farming, right? So corn, beans, and squash. The corn grows up, the beans grow around the corn, the squash runs along the ground. This is a way of growing that supports each crop, but also replenishes the soil so that the nutrients return. One of the things that makes Brooklyn so unique, and I speak as a very biased person who is the Center for Brooklyn History's chief historian, Brooklyn's unlike a lot of places in the world, and also unlike a lot of places in the city, because of the unique fertility of its soil. This dates back all the way from the last ice age. A glacier came down from Wisconsin and deposited a whole bunch of organic matter right into what is central Brooklyn today, right around where Prospect Park is. And so these centuries of mineral and nutritive deposits from the ice age, coupled with centuries of indigenous practice, made this very fertile and profitable soil. And it's not until the Dutch come in and institute the practice of slavery that fertile soil is not just for the enjoyment of indigenous people and the flora and fauna that are indigenous and native to Brooklyn, but now that fertility is turned directly into profit. So we see this kind of pairing of Brooklyn being partitioned up into these different villages over here on the first map. This map is from 1946, but it refers back to Brooklyn during Dutch rule. And then this document that you see here is on display, not in the downstairs of the exhibition, but outside the library. It is the census of 1786. This is an incredibly special document that we're lucky enough to have in our collection. This is before this gathering begins in 1790. This is just Kings County doing a counting of its own residents. And I apologize in advance. I might do a little jumping around just because it's the teacher in me. So we see over here, this last column of the census represents the number of enslaved, the total number of enslaved. The column next to it represents the total number of free white inhabitants. So as I mentioned before, that number was as high as 75% in Flatbush. Flatbush over here, 1786, we have 255 white residents, 223 enslaved black residents. So when we're talking about who's here in our early Republic period, that is what Flatbush, that is what Brooklyn looks like in 1786. That's kind of as we're approaching the high point of slavery in Brooklyn. So to get back to the point I made earlier about the misconception that slavery was more agricultural in the South and more domestic in the North, not only is that incorrect, but also there can also sometimes be a misconception, a false narrative, that slavery in the North wasn't that bad. It was easier. It wasn't this huge plantation infrastructure. People were treated well. People were treated as part of the family. We're very lucky, as I mentioned, it's very rare that you have firsthand accounts of slavery told in the voice and the experience of the people who lived it, but we do have at least one example of this. This is the life, history, and unparalleled sufferings of John Jay, the African preacher, compiled and written by himself. This is a slave narrative from 1806. This is a man who was enslaved in Flatbush, eventually learned to read and write, eventually was able to acquire his freedom and travel the world. And from him, this firsthand experience, and he was enslaved in Flatbush specifically, gives us a sense that this was not an easy time of slavery, right? He writes, "Our labor was extremely hard. The horses usually rested about 5 hours in the day while we were at work. Thus did the beasts enjoy greater privileges than we did." And he goes on in even greater detail to describe the length of the day and the degree of the toil that was life under enslavement that he experienced as an enslaved person in Flatbush. So in thinking about the long, not only reign of slavery in Brooklyn, but also its legacy today, how does it continue to affect our lives today? We wanted to tell a family story in order to make this exhibition more understandable. And so we happen to have in our collection at the Center for Brooklyn History an oil painting of a man named John A. Lott. John A. Lott was a very prominent Brooklynite, also born in Flatbush. He's born in 1806, the same year John Jay writes his narrative. He is a member of the very prolific and influential Lott family. They descend from some of the first Dutch who come over in the 16th century to Brooklyn, make a name for themselves as farmers, and as you might imagine from what I've already shared, as farmers, they're making a profit for themselves as slave owners. So, as I mentioned, a descendant of some of the early settlers, specifically Engelbert Lott, who comes over in 1680. John A. Lott is born into this very prolific slave-owning family. He indeed is born into a family, and I'll kind of tease here. We also have in our collection, if you can see here, a family tree of the Lott family that literally we don't have a table large enough in our building to lay it out flat. The Lotts are incredibly prolific. They have many branches of this family tree, and John A. Lott, I don't know if I can get my cursor over there, but John A. Lott is right here, the Honorable John A. Lott. So John is educated as a lawyer. He is able to have access to that education through the wealth of his family, in part garnered through their slave ownership. He eventually becomes a judge at the kind of local and then the state level, and is responsible once slavery ends. In 1827, when slavery ends, using land to generate a profit through farming becomes less tenable, right? Suddenly you have to pay people, you're not going to be able to make as much money as a farmer. So then, land becomes most profitable if you're renting it out. So the process of transitioning Brooklyn into an agrarian area to an urbanized one means parceling out land and selling lots for residential development. And John A. Lott, as both a massive landowner and also a legal representative of some renown, is hugely involved in that process of how will the lots be subdivided, how will land be valued, where are the major roads going to go that are going to determine which land is most profitable and which most valuable because it's near major transportation. So as you might imagine, he's making those decisions in a way that benefits his family and in a way that benefits families like him. So passes away in the 1870s. His portrait is not just painted once. Happens to be the one from our collection. It's also painted 3 times that we know of. There might be more. One of them hangs in Borough Hall. If you've ever been to a court proceeding in Borough Hall, you've probably passed by John A. Lott. Another hangs in the state court at Albany. So this is someone who's been given his flowers in his time, we can say. We can go to the family tree again. Now, I mentioned he's born into a slave-owning family. We happen to know, again, it's very rare that we have firsthand accounts of the enslaved, but his uncle Jeremiah owned owned a boy named Samuel Anderson. And in 1898, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, Brooklyn's paper of record, went back and interviewed Samuel Anderson, or Uncle Sammy, as they called him, rather diminutively, to get a sense of his life when he was enslaved. And so you can see I've highlighted it here. He talks about he was enslaved by Jeremiah Lott in this particular plantation. His mother was also owned by the Lotts. His father was owned by the Remsons. And throughout this presentation, these names are probably going to sound pretty familiar to you, right? Remsen Street's around the corner. You're going to see some other names that are the streets we walk on, the subway stops that we get off at. So John A. Lott's uncle, who also will become his father-in-law, he married his first cousin. That's how the Dutch got down. Owned this man, Samuel Anderson. And while, like I said, it's rare that we get the first-hand experience of an enslaved person, this feature and this little drawing in 1898 in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle is very different than a gilded framed portrait, right? That and I should mention, sorry, this portrait is 40 inches by 50 inches. It's about 4 feet long. This is a massive scale. This same veneration is not given to the Anderson family. And I went back and I found, again, apologies that the screen is so small, but it so happens that Jeremiah Lott and Abraham Lott, which is John Lott's father, are both on the same page in the 1820 census, so we can see their slave owning kind of side by side. So this is Abraham Lott. One of these slashes here is John Lott, because he's a minor at the time. 1820, John Lott would have been 14. And then Jeremiah Lott, there's him, there's his daughter, who will become John Lott's wife one day. And these little slashes, this is the break, this means now we're talking about slavery on this side. These slashes here and these slashes here will be enslaved people. So we can see that the same household that John A. Lott is living in has enslaved people in it, and one of these slashes here that are not given a name, that are not given any other context, will be Samuel Anderson. So that's where Samuel Anderson shows up in the historical record. So for the exhibition, that inconsistency, that inequality struck me, right? Like here's one family that had every privilege in the world, and they get to be celebrated in this very venerated art form, and another family that gets a little cartoon in the paper, and that's very rare. That's as best as a formerly enslaved person could expect in the 19th century. So we wanted, and one of the reasons we knew about this story, about Samuel and about his experience with the Lotts, is through a family genealogist named Gus Harris. So Gus was researching his family's history and made the connection that Samuel Anderson was his great-great-grandfather. And I should note, that's not that many greats, right? I have memories of my great-grandmother. 2, or 3 generations, or however many generations that is, only your great-great-grandfather was someone who was born enslaved. This is a reminder to us that not only did slavery change Brooklyn, but it changed Brooklyn quite recently, right? We're still very actively living in the aftermath. So, as I mentioned, that inconsistency doesn't sit well with me. And so what we did is we commissioned a portrait to be made to honor the Anderson family in the same way that the Lott family was honored. Now, sadly, Gus Harris, pictured here, who did the research, he has since passed, but he did have a sister, Mildred, and she agreed to sit for a portrait. She lives in Palo Alto now, but she was born and raised in Brooklyn. Her entire family's chain of history has only taken place in Brooklyn, from Africa to Mildred. The Anderson family, which became the Harris family, and then she's now a Jones, was all in Brooklyn. And we did an oral history with her as she was getting her portrait painted. And she shared, she grew up in the 1930s, 40s in Brooklyn, when this was in the heart of the second wave of the Great Migration. Her childhood friends, they would all go down to North Carolina or to Georgia for the summer to visit their extended family. And they would say, oh, where are you going? And she and Gus would say, we're staying right here. We've always been here. Specifically, and I'll reveal, so this is her getting her portrait painted by our community oil portrait artist, Rusty Zimmerman. And so here is the finished painting that's done to the same scale as the Lott painting. So we also had it done 3 feet by 4 feet. And she just made this statement offhand as we were chit-chatting and her portrait was getting made. But it's so profound, and I'm sorry I didn't include a photo. We actually blew this quote up, and it sits like 10 feet up, and it's on the wall in the exhibition. These are my roots. This is where I'm from. This is who we are. We've been here a long time. And I think there are many takeaways in this exhibition, but I think it's very crucial to know that in a time when we're all thinking about belonging and who belongs and who's being welcomed and who's being driven away, that especially when we're talking about Brooklynites of color, our claim to being here is not only just as legitimate as anyone else's. In fact, we have people who Brooklyn is the only place they can claim. This is their American experience. This is their family experience. And I think her, again, offhand quote speaks volumes about how we should be thinking about belonging So going back to, we're going to return to family history in Brooklyn, what it looked like, and how do we know what we know. So we have this watercolor here, and it's blown up really big, again, 10 feet in the air for the exhibition. This is a watercolor that was painted in 1859 by a man named James Van Brunt, and this is his grandfather's farm in what now is the Gowanus area. And it's interesting that this is painted in 1859 because, as I mentioned, slavery ends in New York State in 1827. This isn't necessarily a painting that depicts enslavement in Brooklyn. Now, it's helpful to be able to have a visual, right? This is just a few years after slavery ends. This is what black labor working on farms in Brooklyn would have looked like, which is, to my knowledge, one of the only pictorial representations we have of black farm work in 19th century Brooklyn, to be able to give us a clue. But at the same time, this black figure that's kind of pictured sitting here on a log, just because he wouldn't necessarily have been enslaved in 1859 doesn't mean that he, as a Brooklynite, is not still living with slavery. Of course, this is before the Civil War is fought, and in 1850, our country passes the Fugitive Slave Act, whereby, if you've ever seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, this is the exact circumstances that brought about the experience of Solomon Northrop. Someone could be kidnapped from the North and sold into slavery, and there were, in fact, many bounty hunters who made their living doing precisely that. And even though technically the law was supposed to bring escaped slaves back to the South, think about John A. Lott and how he got into the legal profession. Many of the judges that would be ruling in these cases represented slave-owning families or were sympathetic to slave-owning families, so they often would say, well, you have no way to prove that you're not this person who's escaped, so off you go back into slavery. So thinking about this period where slavery is still touching Brooklyn, there's the fear of being re-enslaved, and then there's also Brooklyn's long relationship with slavery elsewhere. If you've ever been to the Domino Sugar Factory, Brooklyn was an absolute center of sugar refinement and manufacturing. That sugar was grown and cut and produced by enslaved people working in the Caribbean long after slavery ends in Brooklyn specifically, or in New York specifically. We also have the garment industry. Brooklyn plays a large role in not only manufacturing garments, but also as a port, shipping those garments throughout the country, throughout the rest of the world. Especially after the Erie Canal is finished in 1825, Brooklyn's port, specifically the port around Red Hook, becomes an important international shipping center whereby goods that are produced in America are sent around the rest of the world. And at some point around this time period in the 19th century, 90% of clothes worn in America moved through New York at some point. And as one of New York's most important ports, Brooklyn would have had a large role in that cotton produced by slave labor making its way around the country and around the world. So while this painting depicts just a particular farm, just a particular experience, we're using it to kind of paint a picture of how Brooklyn's experience with slavery, its legacy with slavery, is long and important, but also doesn't end in 1827 when emancipation comes to New York State. So for much of this exhibition, what we wanted to do was make it very collections-based. What are the documents? How do the documents tell us the story? There's something that I always feel I feel the gravity of it, that when you poll Americans, time after time, they've done these surveys many times, the source on history that is trusted most by Americans is museums. More than history textbooks, more than journalists, more than documentaries, people trust museums and exhibitions because it's the real objects, it's the real things, right? And while I have quibbles with that, interpretation can lead people astray in different ways that, just because someone's giving you the real document doesn't mean their interpretation is the only one. I do take it very seriously that presenting people with the actual artifacts allows them to come face to face with history and confront the reality, confront the facts. So that is what a lot of our exhibition does. Here's the document, here's what it tells us. These are the facts of how slavery existed in Brooklyn. So we have in our collection a series of journals made by a man named John Baxter. The date 1806 keeps coming up a lot. He immigrates to Brooklyn in 1790, and starting in 1806, which is around the time he starts farming, he keeps a daily journal of his goings-on. And again, he did not make this journal so that we 220 some odd years later could get a sense of the day-to-day experience of enslaved people, but there are plenty of clues or traces that we can find in the journal he left behind. I was lucky enough to have some research help in putting this exhibition together. I had a fantastic researcher named Niall Solomon help me out, and when they were going through this journal, they told me that in this entry from 1806, in June 15th, excuse me, we have an entry for the Great Eclipse. So in 1806, there's a solar eclipse that's visible in Brooklyn. We just had one a couple of months ago, last year. So we can kind of relate to how major that is and how much everyone kind of comes out. Now, I immediately thought of two things. One, sorry to go back and forth, earlier in this entry, we know that just 2 days before, he had gone fishing with one of the Lot family members. So this is a farmer who's, working with the Lots. The Lots are very prominent in this time period. And they go fishing, and they take, we see two Negro, and John Lot's Negroes, and they all go fishing. So part of enslaved labor was farm labor. Sometimes it was fishing to get sustenance for the family. And so we know that these are two enslaved men who are kind of with the Lots in this time period. They're also with John Baxter. They would have viewed this same solar eclipse. I immediately started thinking of Nat Turner's rebellion and how this enslaved man saw a solar eclipse in the South and saw it as a sign from God to rebel, that impossible things are indeed possible, just like the sun being blotted out in the sky. Impossible things like slavery coming to an end were possible. And I thought about these two men. We don't know their names. They're just listed as two Negroes. And how they would have taken in that solar eclipse. For John Baxter, it's important enough to put, to circle it a bunch of times and make note of it. But maybe they would have had similar thoughts that Nat Turner did, right? That maybe impossible things are possible. Maybe they're thinking of freedom. This was the time period of gradual emancipation. They might have known freedom was coming and might have had questions like, well, is it going to end in the country? Am I really going to be reunited with my family? That when we're thinking about these, the emotional impact of the day-to-day life, thinking about a moment as cataclysmic or as impression-making as a solar eclipse, I don't only want to think about how John Baxter thought about it, I want to think about these enslaved men that he was living in Flatbush with. Go to the next document here. So I mentioned that we do a lot of storytelling around bills of sale. So this happens to be the bill of sale of a man named Frank. And we have a number of different bills of sales or indentures in our collection wherein human beings are bought and sold. That is at the heart of what slavery is. But what I highlighted here for you, and hopefully you can see the highlighted areas, is again, what some of these names are, right? We see Vanderbilt, we see Bergen, we see Lot. These are names that, again, are in our subway stops. They're in the streets we walk every day. Some of them even exist amongst the very preeminent people in government and arts and media today. And not only is it notable that they are buying and selling humans, but that this act of selling Frank is also an act of consolidating wealth within families. That even in the listed witnesses to this sale, Sarah Bergen, who is listed, was born a Vanderbilt. The Lot family is intermarrying, again, with each other, but also with these other families, that it's not just, I own an enslaved person, their labor is unpaid, that gives me wealth. That is true, but also that same wealth I pass down to my children. That same wealth my children gives to their spouse when they get married, and our wealth is consolidated. So when we're thinking about the legacy of slavery in Brooklyn, it's not just that profits were stolen, but also that wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy families, and that the wealth that is stolen from the enslaved is also concentrated, right? You are compounding not just a lack of funds, but the consequences of a lack of funds. You're probably not going to be in very good health because you're being worked harder than the horses, remembering John Jay, right? So now when you're getting married, when you're passing down your effects, there's more caregiving responsibility, or there's more money that's needed for doctors and medicine. The same way that wealth is consolidated and concentrated and maintained, inequality and lack of wealth is also consolidated, concentrated, and maintained throughout generations. So it's not just bills of sale that tell us a little bit about how slavery functioned in Brooklyn. We also have things like inventories. So in this case, this is a document from 1796. A man named Jerome Ryerson passed away and left his 2 small children orphaned. And so George Vanderbilt, again, of the Vanderbilts we recognize around the city today, a man named George Vanderbilt took ownership of his estate and was responsible for taking an inventory of everything Jerome Ryerson owned so that it could be held in trust for when his children came of age and could inherit that property. So everything that Jerome Ryerson owned is listed out in this document along with its value. We see at the very top a large kettle. There's a frying pan in there. There are 3 horse whips. And right below 3 horse whips is 1 Negro wench. Typical language to hear. It's kind of painful that that's the language being used. But I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that that is not just dehumanizing language, it's descriptive language. A Negro wench would have been a woman of childbearing age. That would have a direct impact on her value because as a enslaved woman of childbearing age, her body could produce more enslaved people, thus increasing her wealth. I'm sorry, her worth. And so we don't know anything else about this woman. She's not named in this document, so we can't trace her anywhere else in the history. But again, part of the work of looking at these documents that didn't intend to center the humanity of the enslaved, it's up to us to ask the questions that recenter them. So one of the things I think about when I look at this document and I think about the context is also, this is a family story. This isn't a family of enslaved people. There's one woman, right? Is she a caregiver for these children who are going through a grief process? Is she sick with worry about what's going to happen to her now that her master's gone? Is she rejoicing that this master maybe wasn't a particularly great one and there's new opportunity for a better kind of life? These documents that tell us about the purchase and the buying, the selling, the inheriting, and the inventorying of enslaved people are documents that change these people's lives. Sometimes maybe for the better, sometimes maybe for the worse. And while we can't know that, it is important to ask these questions because we don't want to fall into the trap of thinking about these human beings who are vascular, tissue and blood, who lived in terms of just a line item in an inventory. She did have a name, even if we don't know it. She did have a relationship to this family, whether that was a good one or a bad one. And just because these are questions we won't have answers to, does not mean there's not still value in the asking. This is usually the case that enslaved women in particular are often not listed with a name. But this last document I want to put in front of you is a rare instance. I was just asked recently doing press for this exhibition what one of the most moving pieces or an object or a document that I felt especially resonant about. And this is definitely the one that comes to mind. So this is an 1814 bill of sale for a young girl named Mercy, kind of poetically or ironically named Mercy. So she's being sold by Phoebe Lefferts. Lefferts is a name that's probably familiar to many of us as Brooklynites, to Abraham Vanderveer. And whereas the bill of sale for Frank was quite short, as you recall, the bill of sale for Mercy, is this the one? Yeah. It's quite a bit longer. And again, it's a little hard to see the script, especially on a smaller screen. But 2 things stand out. One, at the bottom here, Abraham Vanderveer promises that she will be taught to read and write, at least until she turns 18. Which is rare, again, thinking back to that narrative of John Jay. We don't know why Phoebe Leffert stipulated that she had to learn to read and write, but of course, knowing that before the Civil War, in every state in the Confederacy, teaching an enslaved person to read was illegal and punishable by the law, it is significant that her instruction in reading and writing was part of this legal document, part of the sale of this young girl. But the other piece that's really moving, and again, we can't know exactly what the conditions were of the sale or what was prompting the writing here, but sorry to scoot over again. We can kind of see the editing of this document happening in real time. So there's a line here that says, the said servant, her said master, as well as she will serve her master and his family faithfully and in all lawful business, and shall honestly, orderly, and obediently in all things bemean herself towards her said master and all his during the said time. And after bemean herself, someone's like put in a little bracket and said, and behave. Why did they say that? Was Mercy a particularly unruly child? Had he had instances of enslaved people not behaving themselves before? Had she? We don't know why that little edit was made right there, but it's starting because what it highlights to us is that these two grown adults are exchanging a child, and they're stipulating in a legal document how she's going to behave herself. I have a 9-year-old niece. You cannot tell Sasha to behave herself, whether or not you have the power of law behind you or not. But in this document, where on the one hand, she's being cared for in at least some way, where she's being it's being legally stipulated that she's going to have the skill of reading and writing. We also see that legally, a person who has no ability to consent to this, both by virtue of the fact that they're a child and the fact that they are enslaved and therefore don't have the power to vocalize their wishes, these two adults are making legal promises about how she will conduct herself in the time where she's enslaved by Abraham Vanderveer. And finally, it's significant that, again, much like the woman listed in the Ryerson inventory, Mercy is being sold by herself. We don't know if she's being sold away from her family. We don't know if maybe she's rejoining her family. But one of the cruelest realities of the institution of slavery is that you had no legal right to define your family for yourself or keep your family together. And seeing this bill of sale for a 9-year-old child by herself only underscores that point, that this young girl who should be with her parents, that should be with her family, is being sold from one household to another with no ability to consent to that sale. So that's all quite heavy, right? This experience of Brooklyn's experience of slavery, of the stories of the enslaved themselves, what we can know and what we can't know. And so, hence for this exhibition, why I wanted to highlight the importance of doing family history, because those testimonies can be as uplifting and reinforcing as the histories of slavery can be deeply upsetting and can also be discouraging. So there's a whole section in the exhibition about family genealogy research, and for that we partnered with the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, OGS. It's a national organization that was founded in 1977, but we specifically worked with, the New York chapter, and we're able to tell 3 different stories of Black Brooklynites. And while none of them are Mildred's story of being able to trace their ancestry back to slavery, of course, enslavement is not the only way that Black people end up in Brooklyn, and it's not the only way that Black people encounter obstacles to racial equality while they're in Brooklyn. So beginning with Dee Dee Roberts. So Dee Dee grows up in New York, and she's not particularly interested in family history. It's not really of her concern until later in life. But she knows that her grandmother has this document, and her grandmother very proudly showed this document to her. It says, this means that your great-great-great-grandmother was really important. She was an important lady. And Dee Dee was just kind of like, all right, Grandma, if you say so. She just knew this document existed and that it was important. It's not until Dee Dee began doing family research as a member of OGS that she realized what an exceptional document this is. So this is a set of freedom papers from 1825 whereby the mayor of New York City wrote up papers saying that her great-great-great-grandmother, Rachel Bennett Peterson, is a free woman. And this is significant because Rachel was an indigenous woman. And it wasn't until Dee Dee began working with OGS that she realized that slavery in Brooklyn was both African-American enslaved people, and that also Native people were also enslaved to work on these same farms. And so she began to have a new understanding about her mixed heritage being both Black American and also being Indigenous American, that on both sides her family would have had contact with the institution of slavery in Brooklyn, and why her ancestor Rachel would need this paper proving her freedom, because her freedom would not have been guaranteed. This document's from 1825. It's incredibly rare, and so it's a conversation for another time, but we care very deeply at the Center for Brooklyn History about a concept called post-custodial care. Looking at the documents we just saw, we have a lot of documents from fancy families and people who donated their papers because they wanted the world to know how important they were, right? And it's important that we have those documents. We are going to care for them for as long as we can. We are going to make sure they've been with us for generations. We're going to make sure they're there for generations to come. But none of that means that we think that we're the best place where all these documents should reside. It's incredibly special that Dee Dee's grandmother had this document, the physical copy, to share with her granddaughter and say, this is where we come from. You are part of important people. That document should be with the Roberts family. What we can do is help them care for it. So when we scan this document to use in the exhibition, we're able to give her some acid-free paper and give her recommendations about climate control. We want this history to be available for people, but we don't think that institutions are the only or best place where history should be preserved, that people have the power to preserve that for themselves too. So the second story, and I promise I'm wrapping up soon, is Stacy Bell. She happens to be the president of the New York chapter of OGS, and her story is one of great migration, and we kind of did the storytelling in the exhibition as a love story. So she and her husband are childhood sweethearts. They met as kids in Bensonhurst, grew up together, got married, they've been together ever since. What a beautiful story. But, and this is where the family history comes in, how did they both end up in Bensonhurst? Well, it turns out Stephen's family, her husband's family, were refugees from the 1898 Wilmington Massacre. It's a moment in history not enough people know about. After Reconstruction, and as Jim Crow was on the rise in the South, white supremacist insurrectionists by gunpoint removed democratically elected Black officials from the city council and took their jobs. And no one was sent in to stop them. No one was sent in to reinstate these Black elected officials. There was essentially an armed coup of the government that was allowed to continue for the rest of that city's history. Not only did that change the legislation they passed, of course, but also sent a very strong message to other Wilmington residents that if you think that you are going to become empowered, if you think that you're going to have a voice in this community, by force or by gunpoint, we can take that all away from you. We can take your land, we can take your vote, we can take your family. So of course, a lot of families want to move. Stephen's family is one of them. That's what sends them north. They eventually end up settling in Bensonhurst. Stacy's family is more of a traditional Great Migration story. Because her family in South Carolina happen to be landowners, when things start getting really bad in the Jim Crow South, closer to the 20th century, they decide they're also going to make the move up north. But because the family has land, they want to do it smartly. They don't want to just blow it all at front. And what happens if they come to New York and there's a calamity and all the money is gone? So they kind of send people up one by one to the north from South Carolina until they've established a stronghold in Brownsville. Now, as the family gets to Brooklyn, eminent domain is happening. They're displacing people to build roads, to build highways, and so her family gets moved around through eminent domain and displacement until finally they settle in Bensonhurst. Stacy is born and falls in love with Stephen. It's a beautiful story, but we understand how the very same things that make researching Black history difficult, not necessarily always having land to track and find, and racial violence, deleting entire families off of the trail to follow. The same thing that makes this history difficult can in fact have these, sometimes have these beautiful consequences. And then finally, we have Lynn. Lynn is kind of a foil to Muriel or Dee Dee, who didn't really care about family history until she got older. Lynn always cared about family history, and she shared with me, especially now when, you just saw those census documents. I found those and was able to download them like in my pajamas at my house. Back when she started doing family research, you would have to go to the library, and she shared about how, well, this library had this paper, so you'd have to figure out which bus went to that library so you could get there. She's been putting in the shoe leather to document her family's history, and that work has been rewarded. She found what I think all of us hope to find, which is that her ancestors were important people that were missed when they were gone. So one of her ancestors is Caesar Springfield, who was already known to me as a researcher of Black Brooklyn history. He's one of the founders of the Bridge Street AWME Church. He's associated with those who owned land in Wheatsville. And we have this obituary here that says, quote, when he and his wife passed away in 1872, a noticeable blank has been made among the colored population of the city. Certainly, we all wish that we can find that our ancestors made that much of an impact, but of course, that's not always the case. And I love the fact that even though Lynn's been doing this research her whole life, her journey's not over. She just recently found a document that suggests that Caesar might have escaped slavery in New Jersey, and now she has a brand new kind of a trail to trace. And so this work can be rewarding, but it's also can be unrelenting, because the more you find, the more you have to research. So the last thing as I wrap, I want there to be time for questions. I want people to, be able to mingle and get on with their Sunday. But just to note how slavery is remembered in Brooklyn's history. It's obviously more than 150 years of slavery in Brooklyn. How does Brooklyn deal with the fact that this was the site of enslavement? And that answer kind of that question has a mixed answer. So on the one hand, in 1895, there is this phenomenon that if we didn't have this historical evidence telling us it happened, I kind of wouldn't have believed it. So in Ambrose Park, which is where Sunset Park is today, where the Gowanus Expressway cuts across, in 1895, there is an enormous stage show staging a southern plantation for people to come and enjoy. So they pay almost 500 black actors to dress as though they are slaves, to sing and dance and even pick cotton. They make an acre-large cotton field and have a working cotton gin for people to just go and see and sing and enjoy. And it's a smash hit. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle says, Black America is well worth a visit. The quaint Negro cabins, the cotton field, and the cotton press in operation possess fascination for Northerners, as was shown by the crowd that lingered around and gazed all yesterday afternoon. The show was such a success that it traveled to Philly, it traveled to DC, and it concluded its run right back here in New York City at Madison Square Garden. Now, one of the things, especially as a historian, I'm always looking for other history connections. One of the things that stands out to me about this is 1895 is 30 years after the Civil War ends. Right. These are people who would have had fathers, sons, family members who fought and died to end slavery in this country, whose family is still feeling the wound of what was the cost of ending slavery in this country. But just 30 years later, they're singing and dancing and enjoying watching Black people paid to dress up and pick cotton. I kind of don't know what the takeaway is for that. I think that's for all of us to kind of think about. So this article is from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, but and is in the exhibition. But I also just pulled this for interest. It's not in our collection, so it's not in the exhibition. But there are some photographs of what this stage show looked like, and especially if you can see a little bit that the top of that page from the Illustrated American, the size of it, this big outdoor kind of festival. So that's one way that Brooklyn remembers slavery. We also have, in 1946, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle runs a 6-part series investigating the early history of Brooklyn. So those original 6 towns that we saw in the census in that map. So each village gets its own week. And in the Flatbush week, We have an exploration of everything that Flatbush was. Now remember that sentence, 223 and 255, right? That's the ratio of enslaved to free white. This insert talks about the Dutch, talks about the indigenous history. This was not only Lenape but Canarsie land as well. The English, that's Flatbush's experience of the Revolutionary War. Very ironically, they have this whole section here that I put in the exhibition because of the irony, entitled Seat of Justice, about how much the legal profession grew in Flatbush. Not one mention of slavery throughout all of that. It talks at length about John A. Lott and how he was an important legal mind in Flatbush, and that's a picture of his house on the, not the bottom, this one here, on the bottom right. All of this mention about how important Flatbush is, how important people like John A. Lott were, never mentions once that they were people who owned slaves, that slavery existed at all. So you see how possible it is, a little bit more than a century after slavery ends, to write Brooklyn's history as though slavery never existed. So, these are some of the topics that we get into in our exhibition. I included a nice little photo, and you can see those paired portraits of John A. Lott and Mildred E. Jones in our gallery here. I will end it. I don't know if it's going to play. Maybe it will. A little video we put together. If I just do that, will it play? Just a little bit. So Traces is at the Center for Brooklyn History, open Monday through Saturday, free to all are welcome. We'll be doing some programming alongside this exhibition. We have one program coming up next about reparations and about the relationship between learning the history of slavery and what is owed. We're going to be doing family genealogy workshops in partnership with Odds New York, both here and at some of our other BPL branches. And we hope that you can come out and see. I also spoke to someone who said, maybe when it gets warmer. Fair enough, the exhibition's up through August, so you don't have to go when it's freezing outside. You can wait till a nice spring day and go and enjoy from there as well. But thank you so much for letting me
Questions?
And there are going to be questions.
Oh, sure, questions, yes, please.
I got one.
I'm just going to grab it.
Number one question here.
Where? You. Oh, great. Thanks.
All right, and some people feel free to go if you have to, but we do have some time for questions. I'll start here.
So, I'm thinking that many of these families who owned slaves were church-going folk.
Yes.
And so how did they reconcile owning slaves with what church preaching is, with the church, truth?
Sure. So the question is about these slave-owning families being church-going families as well, and how they reconcile their status as slave owners with their faith. I, of course, can't see into their hearts and think about how they reconcile that for themselves. But one thing we do know is that in many cases, if not most cases, the enslaved would be compelled to go to church with them. And in fact, in the 1898 article that Samuel Anderson talks about being enslaved, he talks about being forced to attend church services in Dutch. This is not the language he speaks, but this is the language of the family who's enslaved him. And so he is forced in the gallery, of course. He's not invited to be in the service with the families that enslaved him. But also in that same article, he talks at length about how freedom for him meant choosing his own faith, right? So that's why he's a founding member of the Bridge Street what he becomes a member of the AWME. He goes on to preach occasionally. I don't know how the slave-owning families reconcile the word of Scripture with what they were doing, but I do know that the enslaved saw freedom as being freedom to choose their own religion, and so I can imagine that the religion that they were being preached about while they were enslaved is not the religion that felt liberating to them. It's not the same word and message that was one of equality, right? That message was much more catered to the comfort of the slave owners.
Years ago, I read a book called Slaves and Family by William Ball, and he traced, because of abuse and, sexual abuse and rape of black women, he was actually able to, in that book, trace his black ancestors. So I was going to ask you, has any treatment like that been done as far as enslavement in Brooklyn and families in Brooklyn, or is that something that was unique?
So the question is about kind of family history as it relates to sexual violence and how, the intermingling between the enslaved and the slave owning results in kind of mixed bloodlines. I don't know about any specific instances in Brooklyn. No one's kind of come forth, or the folks from OGS haven't revealed any of that history specifically. But I do know that most of the people who were enslaved in Brooklyn did not end up staying in Brooklyn. So a lot of those folks left for further north, left for Canada. Lynn has an ancestor who actually ended up in Australia. So as people leave the area, they also kind of take some of those connections and stories with them. So as they're doing their 23andMe or the other kinds of things, the story of how they became intermixed and the story of where that intermixing happens becomes increasingly pulled apart. So I don't have a smoking gun of a story there, but I know that one of the reasons why we might not have as many of those stories is because Mildred's case is not, there are other families that know that they trace their history back to enslavement in Brooklyn, but it's quite rare because most of them left after slavery ended.
You mentioned indigenous agricultural expertise.
Yes.
Which raises the question to me as to, in the name of only economic efficiency, why would the Dutch and later the British go all the way to Africa? Why wouldn't they just enslave the indigenous people who knew the land and didn't have to take all the second passage?
An excellent question. So it's about why bring in African enslaved people when the stewardship of the land was being done at such a high level by the indigenous. It has to do with the crops that are being grown. So the indigenous people are largely doing subsistence agriculture. These are the plants that we're going to be eating or feeding our livestock that we're maintaining or that we're going to be storing for winter, these gourds, etc. Some of that's happening in Brooklyn as well, but some of it's also cash crops. So barley, water's not safe to drink. Cholera outbreaks are happening. So barley is really important to make beer because beer is actually safer to drink than water is because it's, it has alcohol in it. So these aren't crops that are indigenous to the area, and so it's less about growing things in a way that sits well with the habitat. It's about let's grow the crops that are going to be most profitable regardless of the impact on the soil. And so there were some cases where crop rotation wasn't being done and replenishing nitrogen back in the soil wasn't being done. So some of the fertility of the soil depletes over time because whereas the way that indigenous folks were cultivating the land, they could do it year after year with no problem. If you're just growing barley in the same field year after year, your crop is going to be diminished year after year because you're not replenishing the soil with the nutrients, the nitrogen, the micronutrients that crop needs. And so at that point, might as well bring in African slaves because you're going after volume and profit and not sustainability.
So why do you get more volume and profit with African slaves as opposed to the indigenous slaves?
Well, you also can control the volume. And also, indigenous slaves, if you're enslaving indigenous people, their people are around. They can come back and get them, right? So an African slave, we know famously, you're being stolen from your culture. You're bringing in a Muslim person from Mali and then someone who's Igbo from what's now Nigerian, that these are people who are less able to form coalitions and support because they've been stolen. And many of them are coming from the Caribbean as well. So they're not necessarily brought from Africa to Brooklyn, but as part of remember the diagrams of the triangle trade back in grade school, they're being brought to the Caribbean and then being sold back to Brooklyn and then being sold back to Guyana. So they're increasingly pulled away from their culture and thus not as able to form coalitions and to escape. Yes?
You just mentioned my dad's tribe. My dad's Igbo, so I was just...
Oh, nice.
So, interesting, the first question was about, sexual violence and everything like that. And I the first thing that jumps to my mind with the document of the 9-year-old between Phoebe and the other dude was that there is, I don't know what year was that, because that seemed like, if I remember, it was before it was legal for Black people to read and write. And so the second I heard an extension of privilege to a colored or Black person, I immediately thought of, there was an episode of Know Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates, and it was a football player that was tracing his ancestry, so they ended up at like a slave trading place in Ghana. But his ancestor that was like the kind of like the first to be freed was actually a product of a union between a slave master and a child. And so the privilege of her being freed and with her children being freed was because that they were half white. And it was sort of like a sympathy that was extended to them. So the second I saw this 9-year-old child that's being like, it's in a contract that they have to read and write, I'm like, that's a great sympathy, you know, to extend to like a child if they're Black, but I'm also thinking like, what's the lineage of this child that thing is. So like for me, that was reading between the lines of this and like how usually there's like, oh, there's white ancestors somewhere, and so they're extending this sympathy.
100%. It's something that, you know, you mentioned asking questions of these documents to center their humanity. In some ways, that's a me thing, and I just didn't want to, on our walls, as we're putting people up, encouraging them to think about these kinds of things. It's already heavy, but you're exactly right. These kinds of things do happen. I actually just finished a book over the weekend by Mary Berry called Slavery After Slavery that talks about the apprentice system. So even after slavery ends, there are all kinds of legal loopholes by which, especially if a enslaved child had been orphaned, like Mercy, or by themselves, even if you know who their family was, slave owners or former slave owners can say, well, they're all alone in this world because you don't have like you don't have a birth certificate saying this is my mother. So the person who has the strongest claim to that child will actually be the person who formerly enslaved them rather than their family, even if they exist. And so they would be kept under a version of slavery that was called an apprenticeship. And while sometimes that was, keep doing farm labor, I want to get profits off your labor, there was also a sexual violence component to that, whereas enslaved children, formerly enslaved children, would be kept on as apprentices under the guise of labor or learning a trade, but really they were being kept close for far more nefarious reasons. So there's a lot we know about sexual violence, there's a lot that we don't know, but I think one thing that is very clear is that if the facts aren't explicit, assuming that it didn't happen is not as strong a bet as assuming that it did.
In the back over. Oh, sorry.
You mentioned earlier in your presentation hitting a wall, you know, and then
They call it the 1870 wall sometimes.
Yes, and then you mentioned the couple from the lady from South Carolina. I hit a wall, right? But then I'm thinking because you know I do have some documents, census documents that actually mention like my grandfather, right? But I know my great grandfather was brought here as a slave. I'm thinking that instead of just looking at my family, looking at the family that owned our family.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and seeing if names come up. You mentioned that they're not all the time the people who were enslaved, their names show up. But I'm thinking that researching, you know, not for nothing, I went through Aiken, South Carolina. My last name is on the street sign.
Right.
Barton Brothers, they had a whole thing down there. So is it possible to do it that way?
It certainly is. And the book that won our Brooklyn Public Library Nonfiction Book Prize this year is a book called, forgetting the name of it, Black Folk. Yes, that's the name of it. And she makes a point in there, forgetting the scholar's name, he's on the committee, but the name is escaping me. But in any case, she makes a point that I hadn't really considered before, which is I think a lot of us say, well, this family enslaved you. Why would you keep their name? Like, why wouldn't you give yourself a new name? Some people did. The prevalence of the African-American surname Freeman is an obvious example. But the point she makes is that oftentimes that last name doesn't represent your family, it represents the community that you were from. People were sold away all the time, and so after slavery ends, the first thing that people wanted to do was not vote, was not, move away. It was reunite with their families. And so having that last name, as painful as it is to identify with the people that enslaved you, is one way that you made yourself findable for people. So focusing on the family that enslaved is actually maybe your best bet of finding who your actual people were, because those last names are not just families, they're communities. So even if it's not a blood relation, these were the people who sustained life for one another.
I went on Facebook and some lady, she said, we got the same last name and our people are from the same part of South Carolina. She was the one that found my ancestors on the census.
Right. And if you have a Brooklyn Public Library card, you all should, you can access Ancestry.com and use all those census papers. You have to log in with your library card, otherwise they're gonna paywall you. But if you log in with your library card,
That's how she did it, yeah.
you can do it on our website. If you just log in through there, free, don't pay for it. Your tax dollars pay for it. Yes.
Yeah, resistance, whenever there's been slavery, there's always been resistance.
Yes.
And that takes the form of everything from killing your master, violent, to creating your own religion, to working slowly. Is there evidence of resistance in slavery in Brooklyn? And is there any, I don't know if it's in your show, in your presentation, and then what was the importance of places like Weeksville from 1838 and free black communities that were created, or were there any maroon communities that were also in and around Brooklyn for people to run away to as a form of resistance?
Sure. So when it comes to resistance, there are two ways to answer that, and it's linked. So on the one hand, I want to uplift the work of scholar and dear friend Preeti Kanakamadela, who just published a book this year called Brooklynites, and it's about the free black community in Brooklyn after slavery ends from the 1830s up through the 1880s or so. It's the best source, it's the best book. I'm biased, she's a dear friend, but it's up for all the book awards this year. It's really great. She addresses some of that history about why places like Weeksville and the founding of black churches are so important. So yes, that form of resistance of creating a safe spot is important, and chiefly because if you remember that slide with the man sitting on the log, and we talked about the Fugitive Slave Act, thinking about that scene, right? You're the only black laborer and everyone else working on the farm with you is white. If a bounty hunter comes in and is looking for enslaved people he can trap, kidnap, and sell back into slavery, the one black person standing out is going to be a pretty easy target. In a community like Weeksville, where almost everybody is black, and you have black papers, and you have black churches, and you have black schools, someone's going to notice if you go missing. Someone's probably going to, in a very close relationship to what we're seeing now, say, I saw the bounty hunter the other day, guys be careful out there, La Migra, that in communities like Weeksville, after slavery ends in Brooklyn, but you're still at risk of being sold into slavery, those black communities where people can be safe are even more important. And we see that in Weeksville in 1863, when famously there's the draft riots in Manhattan, when white New Yorkers were upset about being drafted into fighting a war to end slavery when they don't particularly they don't care as much that slavery continues or not. They riot, go after black New Yorkers. New York loses about a third of its black residents as in the aftermath of the draft riots, because people are so terrified they leave New York permanently. Many of them flee to Weeksville. So those places where black communities come together are incredibly important to keep people safe. Now, when it comes to other forms of resistance, you also had vigilance committees to combat the fact that people were so vulnerable. So they would be much like we have, we see for the Underground Railroad to protect people who are escaping slavery. You also have networks to keep people safe when kidnappings are happening. So, and then it's not in the exhibition again. That's a personal choice, not wanting to put some of the most upsetting history on the walls, but it certainly is there that there are quite a few instances of enslaved people killing their masters, and the early republic is still figuring out its legal system. Remember, seat of justice, they're kind of still building that up. So those are some of the earliest cases of the death penalty, for example, because the legal apparatus wanted to make an example of enslaved people who engaged in violence against their masters. Yes?
So, Quakers, were they against slavery, and were they aggressively against slavery, or just quietly against it?
Sure, so I don't know much about Quakers in Brooklyn. I know that there was a community of Quakers out in Flushing. This is actually as early as the 16th century, because it's one of the earliest instances of like religious freedom or the cause being made for religious freedom in New York City. A document called the Flushing Remonstrance is about Quakers wanting to protect their religion and protect themselves against a mandatory one religion for Flushing. They said, no, we're Quakers, we're against slavery, and we want to be free to practice. So I do know that they are much more prevalent in Queens and what will become Queens in Flushing, and that anti-slavery is part of why they're so adamant about religious freedom. But I don't happen to know about the Quakers in Brooklyn, and would love to, because usually where there are Quakers, there are abolitionists, there is very emphatic resistance to slavery, but I don't happen to know.
How resistant were they in Manhattan?
In the Quakers in Manhattan, I don't know. I know they were in Jersey as well, and obviously in Philadelphia, but I'm not sure in Manhattan. I mean, for some of this time period, we have to remember as well that it's not really until the 1700s and the 1800s that we have like a civil society. I think the work of people like Russell Shorter remind us that, especially in the early days of the New Netherlands, and it's a Dutch outpost, there's not like a lot of like genteel religion. It's a motley crew of opportunists who are really making up New York City. That this isn't kind of like established religion. These are kind of a motley crew of ne'er-do-wells who are basically cast out of Europe, and they decide to cast their lot here. So lots of scalawags and scamps until the English and then the English take over and then the Revolution. Yeah.
So I wanted to know if you have got an understanding of going to around the evaluation on the wealth that was stolen out of the black slave community, and that that valuation would be like a GNP. Like, how much GNP did slavery contribute to, you're doing New York, but to the New York area, and how much is that GNP worth in today's dollars? And especially since it would be multiplied down. I mean, basically the concept being that wealth was stolen from the black community, was given to the white community, that wealth could have been able to, things that could have compounded over the years, was compounded somewhere else.
Absolutely.
And you're talking about retribution,
so we don't have any ongoing projects about that in Brooklyn specifically. It's hard to get super local with it, but there is a state commission on reparations that, as of right now, is still allowed to go about their work of determining exactly what that looks like, and also creating a set of recommendations about, okay, we should find out what that looks like in dollars and cents. And also, what does that look like in terms of what is fair, what is reasonable, what is meaningful in terms of what should be done. That on the one hand, we should just know. We shouldn't just say, wealth in some amount was expropriated from black people and given to these white slave-only families. Having those numbers is critical. And so that's definitely stage one, and that's kind of where they're at now. But part of the task of that commission is also to make financial, cultural, educational recommendations about now how we go about redress and not just research. Yes, and New York City has one as well. Again, as of right now, the New York City Council also has a commission to be exploring that in New York City specifically.
an evaluation on it.
Yes, but the state one started 2 years ago, I want to say. The city one just started last year, so they're in very, very early stages.
I was gonna kind of answer your question. There's a fabulous book called The Stolen Wealth of Slavery. It was a case reparations, the stolen wealth of slavery. And it's a lot of breakdown, and it counts for like inflation and a lot of the amounts of like what they made in 1822 and then what that is to today. And I'm like only like 2 or 3 chapters in it, and it's giving me like breakdowns. A lot of these people, a lot of people are talking about the bank founders that in some way were connected to slavery, and they were also giving loans out to southern slave owners. So there was a lot of profit that was made, here, building like Wall Street, but it's a fabulous book, but that gives you like a really good breakdown of a lot of the actual numbers.
And like I mentioned before as well, that it is important to know those figures and to have a sense of scale for the dollars and cents, but the effects of being kept from wealth are also compounding. So that same book, Slavery After Slavery, she does fabulous work in tracing some of those families down to today and explaining how, 3 generations of the men in this family passed away early due to strokes or heart attacks. We know that there's an effect that financial stress has on the body, and that's compounding. If you're paying medical bills, you're paying with money that your already were kept from. So the disparity in wealth goes back to the dollars and cents that were taken during slavery, but it doesn't end there. It compounds over time as people deal with over stress and the lack of access to resources created by generations of being enslaved, both not being able to make that money, but also that treatment and that third-class citizenship treatment.
Also, I just mentioned it, maybe it's a to see you. My son actually went to Berkeley Carroll in private school. Like all the private schools around here, there's some legacy of slavery. He actually did a report on the legacy of slavery at Berkeley Carroll. So the founders, where they got their money from, and how it was a lot of them were slave owners. They basically built this private school, and the school was originally named after a priest who, was a priest to espouse, the priest, but a Catholic bishop, I think.
Right.
Who espoused slavery and did all this stuff where he was talking about it. So it was just an interesting report that he did about, how this private school has all this links to slavery. They all do, just focus on the one he was at.
Right.
One more question here.
Okay, I'll take one more, and then I promise I'll give you your Sunday back.
How did slavery
Do the shares
end?
in a few minutes. How did slavery end? So, it didn't perhaps, but the official process of slavery is a process of gradual emancipation. So it begins in the 1790s, and it basically looks like a series of pieces of legislation that say for enslaved people born in this year, you will no longer, you will work for a period of X amount more years, and then you'll be free. And then the final piece, I think, comes in 1799 that basically says no matter when you're born, 1827 is going to be the cutoff date. So, January 1st, 1827, all people are enslaved, but some people were manumitted before then because they were born in 1795 and they did 18 years, and so it was a gradual emancipation, in part so that these families could get their affairs in order, right? We see in other instances what happens when emancipation comes suddenly, i.e. the American South, how much there's corruption, how much there's scrambling to kind of get your affairs in order. And so part of New York State's gradual emancipation is so that people could set their affairs in order. We could do some last purchases. A lot of those bills of sale that we looked at were from 1814, 1816. These families knew that slavery was ending, hence why some of them are bills of sales and indentures, because it's not for the rest of this person's life, it is for that period during which they will be able to be enslaved. And so that probably has a bearing on why Mercy is being taught to read and write, for example, because it is known that if she's, and that's from 1816. If she's 9 years old at the time, she will need to, make a living for herself after slavery ends, and so this is maybe seen as part of that. So it's a gradual period starting in the 1890s, but ending for everybody in 1827, allegedly. But again, apprenticeships, all these other things, being kidnapped and sold back into slavery. That won't end fully until after the Civil War.
Right.